again. Okay.
My name is Sally May, and I came to Marquette in 1964 with my husband. He had accepted a position at Northern Michigan University teaching economics. We have lived here ever since, raised 2 boys here, and I became involved with the women's movement in Marquette quite by accident. In probably the late 60s, there was a great deal of discussion about Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. And a number of people had read it and had apparently started consciousness-raising groups consciousness-raising group in Marquette. A friend of mine who lived across the street, she called me and asked if I would be interested in going to one of the meetings, and we both kind of laughed and thought it probably would be very silly, but we decided to go anyway, and it really changed our lives, and we continued to go, and out of those consciousness-raising groups, which incidentally grew and grew and grew every time we went to another meeting on a subsequent week, there would be many more women who had been invited, and it grew so large that we actually had to break up the groups into smaller groups because we didn't have a house that was big enough to hold all of us. And it was out of those consciousness-raising groups that the Women's Center, as it is today, really became what it is.
All right. Could you share a little bit of the chronology and how things evolved and developed over time?
There were some folks in the consciousness-raising group, and I think it was probably Pat Miklo and Carlin Rapport and some others who were interested in establishing a women's center. And they learned that at Oakland University there was a women's center, and asked if the director of the women's center would come and talk to us about what they did and how they were established, to give us some idea of where we might go with that. At the same time, I imagine it was those same women who contacted Northern Michigan University and asked if the university would host a conference for women throughout the UP, and they agreed. And the conference was called The Changing Role of Women in the 70s, and this was in 1972. And the woman from Oakland University came. She was the keynote speaker, and she talked about their women's center. And we broke up into small groups and discussed it. And at the end of that session, we took a vote of all the women who were there, and there were about 150 women who attended, asking if they would like to have Northern Michigan University establish a women's center on campus. And they unanimously said that they did. So a number of women went to Northern and talked with John Jamrich, who was the president at the time, and he agreed that a women's center could be established in the Department of Continuing Education. And he asked Don Jackson, who was the director of continuing education at the time, to help a small committee of women set up the Women's Center. And that small committee was made up of myself, Pat Miklo, Marilyn Gorski, and Gail Griffith. Gail Griffith was teaching chemistry at Northern, and she was appointed by John Jamrich as the interim director until we could find a permanent director. And so our small committee then met regularly, evaluated applications and resumes for the position, and then recommended that Holly Greer be appointed as the director. And so that was really how it got started.
Did Northern's support for this include financial support, or did you have to begin fundraising for this activity to go on? How did that all evolve?
Yes, it did include financial support. I believe that Holly was hired perhaps as a 1/3 time director, although she she worked much many more hours than that. They gave us office space and all of the resources of the university. They also provided funding for a half-time counselor, which was really important, and that counselor was Judy Russell. And then Holly and Judy began the Women's Center then in 1973 and really shaped it in terms of really as a volunteer organization, because that was pretty much all of the funding that was provided by Northern. And so workshops, people who led workshops and so on, they all had to be volunteers. So, and then Holly did establish an advisory council of women in the community to help guide what she and Judy were doing to get the Women's Center going, and really established the shape that it took under their leadership really continued on into the next years.
You mentioned Oakland University, but did they have other models to follow? The creative energy that it would take to come up with these programs is amazing to me. Were they coming all from themselves, or did they have examples to...
Well, as I understand it, Oakland had a pretty vibrant women's center. I'm sure that Holly, and hopefully you'll speak with her, that Holly could fill you in on what kinds of additional things they added to it, and much of it has to do with what resources you have and what the needs are in your particular community. The exciting part of it was that there were so many women from throughout the UP who became involved, and while the Women's Center was at Northern, which was through 1980, the Joan Curto Halfway House for Chemically Dependent Women was established as a separate entity. The Spouse Abuse Shelter was established also as a separate entity. The Rape Crisis Support Team, which were all volunteers, was established to provide support and advocacy for women who were raped. And those same people worked with the hospital to be sure that in the emergency room that there was a rape evidence kit that was there, and that everyone was taught how to use it, and there was a complete protocol. The volunteers were on a pager system, so they could be called at any hour of the day or night. Whoever was on call would go and be supportive and be at the hospital or at the police station or wherever the victim was to provide advocacy and support.
Okay. We're noting that the 45th anniversary is 40th anniversary is coming up. So from those beginnings to now, could you highlight a few of the key transitions to where we are now in terms of, I know it's no longer under the auspices of NMU. Could you kind of explain that overview?
Well, in 1980, the university did an evaluation to determine what programs they would and would not continue, and in spite of the fact that I believe it was a blue ribbon committee that was set up to look at various programs and determine and prioritize which ones should stay and which ones should be eliminated, the Women's Center came in, I believe, second highest in priority of, say, 10 programs that were under consideration for being eliminated. But in spite of that, the administration decided to not continue to fund the Women's Center, although they offered to continue to provide office space and so on, but any of the other services, and of course our director and counselor, and none of that would be continued to be supported by the university. So during the time that the Women's Center was on campus at Northern, the advisory council, the community advisory council, of which I was a member, we had talked a great deal about what the future of the Women's Center was, whether or not it made sense for us to continue to stay on campus, because it was difficult for some women in the community to overcome the idea that this was a women's center for university women, since it was on campus. And we were constantly trying to get the word out that no, this is for all women and not just university women. So when it looked like the university was going to be withdrawing a major portion of their support, we had a choice. One was to stay on, do fundraising to raise money for our staff, and continue to stay on campus, or whether we should become a community-based organization, which would make us perhaps more accessible for all women, and become a 501c3 organization. Although I have to say that was terribly scary, because that meant we had no support, absolutely none. So, but that was finally the decision that our advisory council made, and we did then apply for 501c3 status and establish a board of directors, and then we left campus. And at that time, Holly and her husband moved from Marquette, and I was hired as the director at that point. St. Paul's Episcopal Church allowed us to have offices in the basement of their guild hall without charge. And so we began to try to establish ourselves as a community organization. But before we did that, we put out a call to the community and asked if the community wanted us to continue, because we knew that we would need community support if we were going to continue. And about 100 people came and unanimously said, yes, we want the Women's Center to continue. And many people offered to help. So that was the beginning. It was certainly a crisis, but also an opportunity, as the Chinese character always says, a crisis and opportunity equals danger. And so we then began to fundraise like crazy, and tried to establish ourselves as a community-based organization.
Did you have particular expertise in the fundraising, or was that something you just had to work your way through?
Well, we had some people who had some
Grant writing experience? Or?
Some people had grant writing experience, and we were all kind of threw ourselves into it. We had, I think, more passion than expertise. And we struggled mightily, and I know I was supposed to be half-time, and when I got paid, sometimes I did and sometimes I didn't, and I worked, many, many hours, as you might imagine, and I was happy to do it. And of course we did have our volunteers, like the rape support team, and we were able to get grants to help us continue with that, and so that did work out, but it was very difficult until Sally Bentley, who was one of our volunteers, who worked in the accounting department, I believe it was, or the bookkeeping department at Northern, and she agreed to help us with our payroll and to keep our books and that kind of thing. And at one point she said, well, why don't you start a bingo game? And we all said, well, what could we possibly make in bingo? So she said, well, my husband runs the, I believe it was the Kiwanis, but it was one of the bingo games in town. And I said, well, how much do they make? And she said, $45,000 a year. And I said, all right, let's try bingo. And so we did then establish our bingo game, and this was the first opportunity for us to have a regular income for our programs, and this was really a turning point for us, because eventually the church did ask us to pay rent, and then after that it seemed like there was always a crisis of some kind or another. And the next crisis was that the place where everyone held their bingo in Marquette was at the Marquette Armory. Well, not all, but many of them. And we started hearing rumors that the Marquette Armory was perhaps not going to be renting to bingo anymore, and this would have been a disaster for us because this was our major source of support. So we decided we should try to find a permanent home for our offices, and hopefully a building that would be big enough so that we could not only have our own bingo game, but we could also rent to the other bingo games who were no longer going to be able to be at the Marquette Armory anymore. And so we looked around for different buildings, and we saw that the building, which was the old Whittock Supply building on Front Street, had been empty for a good period of time.
That was South Marquette, right?
South Marquette,
yeah.
right? And it had been empty for quite a long time, except that Johnson's Printing had a portion of the building they were renting from Jim Whittock, who owned the building, and had since left the area. And there was this huge space in the back that at the time was being used periodically as a bus garage. It had originally been built by Bob Brebner Machinery, and so it was a huge garage in back, which we thought if we could possibly fix it up, we could have a wonderful bingo hall there. A lot of parking and that kind of thing. It seemed perfect. But of course we had no money. And so I contacted the person who was representing Jim Whittock, the realtor, and asked him how much it would cost to rent and whether the building was for sale and that kind of thing. And he provided an estimate that was like 3 times more than we could possibly pay for office space in the front, and that we would have to fix it up ourselves. We'd have to pay for having it fixed up. And so I knew the father of a friend of my son's worked at Whittock Supply. So I called him and asked him if he knew how I could get a hold of Jim Whittock. And he told me that he lived in Florida. He had his number and he would give it to me. He gave it to me. I called Florida and talked with his wife. And she said, well, he's visiting his, this is funny, visiting his brother in Iron Mountain as we spoke. And here's the number. So I called him. And I asked him, I told him what the Women's Center did, and I asked him if he would donate the building.
Bold you were.
I know. It was pure desperation, and because I thought perhaps it had been empty for a long time, and I didn't know what his portfolio looked like, and that perhaps it would be a tax incentive, who knows, I was hoping. And he said, well, I'll meet you there tomorrow. So he came and talked with me, and we walked through the area, and he said, how much are you paying at the church? And I told him, and he said, you can pay that, and you can, if you fix it up yourself. And he donated $1,000 to get a start. So then we put together a great number of volunteers to help us, including many of the labor unions who were in the contracting business and to help us. And we got donations for supplies and building supplies and that kind of thing. And we put together an office space. And then we signed a lease with Jim Whittock that gave us the right of first refusal on a purchase of the building. And then we were there for a few years trying to set aside money to eventually buy the building. And then way before we had enough money to do that, he said he wanted to sell. And he told us how much he wanted for the building, which was way more than we could come up with. We ended up putting together a creative sort of purchase plan. Jerry DeFon, who was a personal friend of Dominic Jacobetti, who was at the time in the state legislature and was the chair of the Appropriations Committee and had been for a number of years and was always bringing good things to the UP. She talked to him and he said he would help in whatever way he could. And so he was able to get us funding for many of our programs, which then helped us put our money from bingo and that kind of thing toward the purchase of the building. And so we did purchase it. We
This
also
was the late 80s, was it?
yes, I think it was in 85 or 86. And so one of the things was that we had, even with Dominic Jacobetti's help, we still came up a bit short. But Peggy Frazier, who's very clever, she said, well, perhaps, I know when we talked, if I can digress for a minute, we talked with Jim Whittock about it. He said, well, I want to get a certain amount of money for the building because I'm thinking of my heirs and, that kind of thing. And so Peggy said, well, if he's concerned about his heirs, perhaps for the portion that we can't, right now that we can't cover, we could buy a life insurance policy on him. And she said, well, it only cost us $17,000 to get a $100,000 life insurance policy on him. And perhaps he would agree to that. And I think he wanted to help us, and I think this was, oh, sure, okay, that will work. And so he agreed, and that's how that happened, yeah. And interestingly enough, some years later, and he gave us another $1,000 too, he was so generous. Then some years later, we got a call from his attorney to say that they had just discovered that since we purchased the life insurance policy on him, we were the beneficiaries. And so would we sign over? I said, of course we will. So we signed over that over to him. So that was kind of a funny little thing that happened. But then we launched into this another big renovation project of this big garage in the back to make it the best possible bingo hall that we could possibly make. And again, had so many volunteers, and including, we couldn't have done it without the labor unions who came in at once again and helped us. Jack LaSalle, I remember calling him and asking him, and I always laughed and said, Jack is so organized that I call him, and before I've hung up the phone, everybody's there, and all these people have come. So it was really really heartwarming. And so,
did you have any difficulty recruiting then groups for the bingo hall, or was that kind of a no-brainer?
No, then it was such a wonderful bingo hall, and of course the Marquette Armory pretty much was phasing out their rentals for that purpose. That before we knew it, we were renting every night of the week.
And was that a significant source of income?
Oh, it was a significant source. And then we also had a kitchen that we had, as portion of that back portion, we had installed a really nice kitchen that we could, and from the kitchen we could serve snacks and that kind of thing at the bingo. So it was our concession stand. So we made money from the concession as well as the rentals. Yeah. So
okay, then take us forward to, has it been a holding pattern in terms of programs, or is there still a lot of creativity drawing new programs?
Well,
how does all that work?
Well, I was still the director, and we had then moved into the new building. As I mentioned before, the Spouse Abuse Shelter Project had been a separate organization. It had been the Women's Center. The people of the Women's Center had helped establish it, but it had been set up as a separate organization. Well, then it was when we were involved in this renovation, the state domestic violence board came to us and said that they wanted us to take over the Spouse Abuse Shelter program.
Had they been managing it?
Well, they hadn't been managing it, but they provided the funding for it, yeah. And so I remember saying, oh my God, how can we do that? We have so many things going on, but they said, well, they would close it if we did not do this, and we couldn't imagine it being closed because it was so necessary. So we agreed to take it on, and for me personally, this was really difficult because I had not a clue as an administrator how to run a 24/7 facility, crisis residential facility. But I had people on my board who were willing to help, and so they helped me to do that. And so there was that program that we took on, and of course we were continuing to do the rape crisis. And then one of our counselors was quite interested in the whole issue of child sexual abuse and how that affected adults as they were going into their lives. And she had attended some conferences and so on, and she really encouraged us to get involved in that also. So we did establish a program to help with support groups and working with therapists and that kind of thing, and bringing experts in to talk about it, to establish a support system and a crisis team, actually, for victims of childhood sexual abuse, and try to help to increase the awareness of this, that yes, this does happen, and it happens to way more many people than we ever thought, and it does affect their lives. And so we...
Did the law enforcement people in the region respond to the...
Yes, we were blessed to have Gary Walker as our prosecuting attorney. He was very supportive, and Pat Nicklow, who was one of the founding mothers of the Women's Center, had subsequently gone to law school and became an attorney, came back to Marquette and was hired, the first woman to be hired. Gary hired her as an assistant prosecuting attorney, and she, of course, as a feminist and as a founding mother of the Women's Center, was very helpful in encouraging Gary, who was very open and supportive to all of the support and help that.
And how about law enforcement officers in terms of helping women get to the medical services they needed?
Yeah, there was a lot. I think that the law enforcement people were pretty receptive, and
took some educating, I would
yeah,
assume.
I think, well, all of us needed to be educated. Even those of us at the Women's Center. I mean, we didn't have any, innate knowledge about any of this. We were all kind of learning as we went along, but everyone was very open and supportive. We were really fortunate to have a community of helping professionals that really wanted to help for the most part. And of course, having, as far as the law enforcement people are concerned, having the prosecuting attorney's office heading the whole thing in terms of providing
resources
training and
treatment.
yeah, and being supportive of what we were trying to do was really key. And throughout this time, the women's movement nationwide was having an effect, I think, on everyone too, and increasing awareness about women's issues. So.
I know one of the things that's come up, and I don't know where you picked it up, but I think maybe from the very beginning, was helping women see their potential in non-traditional, from the past, women's activities, that suddenly they could be a fireman or a
Exactly.
policeman or a builder or whatever. Was that a component of the programming?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because when Holly was running the program at Northern, one of the programs was non-traditional jobs, because so many women were the heads of their households. They were single parents, and they needed to make good money, and up until that time they felt that they had limited options, and those options were often jobs that didn't pay as well as some of the construction jobs and that kind of thing. And so we did have, Holly had a staff person who was going out and talking to the various contractors and encouraging them to hire women.
Did you also have to encourage women to see the potential for doing those things, or was there like a ready audience ready to go if the jobs were there?
Well, I think there were some women who were ready to move into positions like that, but some, understandably, were concerned because they weren't sure that they would be able to do it. And there was some resistance by some men who were in construction, that not just in Marquette but throughout the country,
Really? Yeah.
that, well, somehow feeling that their job would somehow be diminished if a woman could do what they were doing. And I think that was hard for the women who were going into these jobs, because that resistance sometimes became, well, resulted in some
Harassment,
mean things,
yeah.
harassment, that kind of thing. So it was definitely an issue, and some of the contractors, one contractor I remember said, well, you know, women, we don't want to have women working on construction jobs because they would have to use a porta potty. Well, okay.
Find those in campgrounds too.
I know.
Yeah.
So it was just this mindset, and someone else said, well, a woman's boyfriend or husband wouldn't want her to be working in the mines, for example, because she'd have this mine dust in her skin, and they wouldn't like it and everything. And we kept saying, women have to make a living for themselves and for their children, and they deserve to be able to have good paying jobs to do, and they're willing to do this. And I think about somewhat more recently, the movie North Country.
Perfect example.
Yeah, it was a very, I remember thinking, wow, this was kind of what it was all about.
People went
Yeah.
through. Now, have these threads, the employment, the abuse issues, the rape issues, are those threads still following through from the 80s, 90s into the new century? Does the Women's Center still work on those, or has the emphasis shifted?
Well, I think the emphasis is still, in fact, perhaps more so on the whole issue of sexual and domestic violence, because that seems to be the most difficult issues to deal with.
They don't go away.
They
It's
don't
each
go
generation
away.
or each
Exactly.
group,
And but some of the programs that we started at the Women's Center have been picked up by other organizations in the community, which is wonderful, because they've been kind of incorporated into other.
Can you think of an example of that?
Well, let's see, what would be? I think we used to teach assertiveness training. I think some other organizations are doing that. Community mental health has probably picked up some. I can't think of any others offhand, but maybe some others that you interviewed with.
Well, and in the educating of young people, they're growing up with what you taught them then too, I think.
Right,
that
and one of
stays
the
with.
programs we had that was really, it was called How to Say No, which was really a wonderful program, because what we did, we had a grant, and we trained high school students to go into the middle schools and talk to the kids there about how to say no to sex. And this was really a wonderful program, because it was the high school kids could talk to the middle school kids, and the middle school kids would hear them much more so than hearing an adult talking. Yeah, and so it really was very, very successful, and helped, and helped the high school kids, because they knew they were helping. They were becoming more aware in order to become trainers for the younger kids, and also giving them some leadership responsibilities.
Right, and feeling the respect of the women in the Women's Center,
Yeah.
saying, we think you can
Right.
do a good job.
And a lot of it had to do with showing them when they see advertisements, and sex sells, in advertising, it does. I mean, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's not so subtle, and we taught them how to sort that all out, and to become better able to understand those
Address
things,
that,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, where would you pull this together for now? There are challenges. I know you've said there's been funding challenges. Do you still see a lot of the common things, the community support? You've had to shift gears a little. You're still in the same building, right?
Yes,
And
we're still
doing,
in the same building, and
but now, as I recall, bingo's gone.
yes,
Right.
bingo is gone. And when the tribes started up the casinos, people then the bingo population really
Moved on.
moved, yeah, they moved on and it became much smaller. I'm saying this from what I heard because this didn't happen on my watch when I was the director there, but it was after that. And so what happened is the bingo games just kind of went away. So that was no longer.
How have you compensated for that loss of funding?
Well, at the time, Sue Kensington was then the director at the Women's Center, and she and her board and staff decided to use the space that had been used for bingo for setting up a resale shop, which would help bring in money for the programs, but would also provide donations. They'd been getting donations anyway for domestic violence victims and helping them to get set up in their own, apartments, or helping with household goods, that kind of thing. And so this was an opportunity and a place where people could bring their donations, and then what the clients could not use then could be sold to raise money. And so we still have that resale shop. It's called Pack Rats, and we're trying at this point to do a business plan to increase our revenue from that, but they're doing really quite well. We also are renting out portions of the building. Johnson's Printing left, and Superior Fitness has been in there for some time. And we recently renovated a small suite of offices to rent, and Superior Rehabilitation is in that. And we're also renting the kitchen to someone who's doing catering. So we're trying to use the building as a resource to make money for our programs. So.
And you're still supportive of the spouse abuse shelter?
Well, then we have the spouse abuse shelter, sure, but it's actually a different building. When I was the director, it was on Fisher Street. That's what the building that was owned by the previous spouse abuse shelter board. And then in recent years, and I'm trying to remember how long ago that was, but I was no longer the director. The building that's on Baraga Street, which is right across from the jail, is a much larger facility and was actually renovated for use for the spouse abuse shelter project. Could really house many more people, and apparently was originally owned by the Catholic diocese, and I believe a place where nuns lived years ago. It's a very, very old building, and so now it's nice because it's right across from the jail, it's right across from the sheriff's department and the prosecutor's office and the courthouse and the city police. We used to keep the spouse abuse shelter, which is now called Harbor House. We used to keep its location secret, and even then there was some question, should it be secret or should everybody know that it's there? Because whichever would be the safest for the clients and the residents. We did keep it secret when it was on Fisher Street, but once it became right across from all of this wonderful law enforcement help, the board and the staff at the time decided that everyone should know that it's there, and that would be the safest thing for the clients. So that's what we do now.
And any other points of emphasis at this time? Do you see some trends in what the Women's Center will be called upon to do in the community? Is it,
well,
or are you doing a long-term plan at this point?
Well, we are doing a long-term plan, and we have had, when I came on the board recently, but in the last year and a half, there was a turnover of boards, and a number of us came on, including many of us who are founding mothers, and that's Carlin Rapport and Pat Micklow and myself. And so we want to look now at what the Women's Center should look like in the future, what would be the focus now. Unfortunately, politically, this is not a good time for women. And recently, the violence
In terms of funding, you mean? Funding programs?
the funding, yeah. Well, one thing that I would just mention is that it used to be that you would get a grant, and they would pay you the money. You would bank the money, or maybe they would pay you every month. But anyway, they would pay you in advance, and then you would provide the funding, and you would explain how you use the money. Now you have to spend the money first, and then they reimburse you, and sometimes that reimbursement doesn't come for like 2 or 3 months down the road. So it means that you have to have a cash flow in order to pay your staff and to keep the lights on and keep the heat on and the water flowing, and it's really, really a challenge. So, for example, recently the Congress failed to pass the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act, which was originally established or really put forward by Joe Biden years ago, needed to be reauthorized, and they failed to reauthorize it. The Violence Against Women Act provides funding to the domestic violence boards throughout the country. And so right now there is no Violence Against Women Act, and it was passed by the Senate, and the House refused to pass the Senate version. And so it died at the end of this 112th Congress. So now it remains to be seen what the 113th Congress comes up with. But the other thing about violence against women and about women's reproductive rights, for example, which the Women's Center solidly supports, there's been a great deal on the national level and on the state level of various states to try to restrict women's access to contraceptives, for example. And this for women is an economic issue, and as well as an issue of freedom, of being able to decide how your body is going to be used. So there are many more battles that still have to be fought, and hopefully young women coming up who perhaps have been taking for granted, the things that many women have fought for, will see that the fight is still needs to be fought. And it's not to their detriment that they don't know this. I mean, they've been brought up thinking that they did have reproductive rights, and now, maybe only now, can see that that's not the case, that it can be taken away at any given time. Years ago, Martha Griffiths, who was a congresswoman at the time,
from Michigan. She was
from Michigan,
yeah.
Right? She and then subsequently became the lieutenant governor of Michigan. She had introduced the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, and it frequently is introduced over and over and over again over the years, but at that time it almost passed, but not quite, because it was passed by Congress and then it was put out to the states to ratify, and it failed to be ratified even though it was given an extension on time.
And it was very close to the appropriate number of states, as I recall.
It was, yeah. And so this was very difficult because it simply stated that rights shall not be abridged on account of sex, and that Congress had the right to establish laws to enforce the amendment. That's all it said. But there was a great deal of controversy and it did not pass. And as long as there is no equal rights amendment to the Constitution, in my opinion, we're going to be fighting these battles over and over and over again.
Well, and as you and I have talked about, one of the values of having you ladies, women, who are been involved and seen it from the beginning, share the story, will help make the younger women who, as you say, rightfully take it for granted, that's
Yeah.
all they've known, become aware that they need to be alert and aware and educated about the
Yes.
issues so that they can help pull things along. I guess in closing, if I've overlooked anything, bring it up, but also from your personal opinion, is there a certain thing that you, when you think of your role and think about what the Women's Center has done for the Marquette community, that makes you feel the most bestest? Or just the whole
So
big
many,
picture?
So
Yeah,
many,
yeah.
yeah. Think of all the lives that have been changed as a result, you know, women and their families. And I should say, too, that there were so many well-meaning men who have helped along the way. Without their help, it would have been extremely difficult for us to do what we did, and many of them were our best friends and husbands, and and partners in life. I think I've always said that Marquette is somewhat unique in that it is big enough to get things done, but small enough to get things done, if you know what I mean.
I
Yeah.
do, and I think everybody who's been around here feels that way. Very proud of this community.
Yeah.
That, as you say, organizations, people of all ages and sexes and economic
Right.
means have
Right.
done what they could to
Exactly.
make it a realization.
Yeah.
So I think it's wonderful. We're doing this in 2013. And the
Yes.
40th birthday, and I don't know as we knew that when we
No, we didn't.
decided to do that, but the timing is good. And 40 years is a long time to
It is a long time.
survive and do all these
It
things.
seems like yesterday.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much, Sally Mae,
Yes.
and we hope this is just the beginning of some really instructive and interesting interviews.
Yes, and thank you.
You betcha. Here we go.